The media coverage of the Jesus Christians tends to outweigh their size. Most people who have heard of them recognise the name the Kidney Cult, derived from an initiative where numerous members have donated one of their kidneys to a stranger. What may be surprising is that the person who first suggested the name the Kidney Cult was the Jesus Christians founder himself, Dave McKay. Welcome to Let's Talk About Sects, a podcast about cults around the world. I'm your host, Sarah Steele. Before we get into this episode, a content warning. This podcast deals with issues that some people may find disturbing, related to emotional abuse and controlling behaviours. This episode also includes mentions of physical punishment of children, and it has a bit of coarse language. Please use your discretion as to whether this will be suitable for you and those around you who may be listening too. Please also consider supporting this project via Patreon. Let's Talk About Sects has now been running for 7 years and has always remained completely independent. It relies on listener support to remain viable. Now, on with the show. Dave McKay was born in 1944 in Rochester, New York, one of 6 children to his Nazarene Christian parents. When he was 11, the family moved to Clarksburg, California. In high school, Dave's love of writing was showcased in his work for the school newspaper, which was edited by a young woman named Cherry, who would later become his wife. Dave also had a column in the local newspaper, and he claims to be a slow reader who hasn't read nearly as much as he has written. Religion was a major part of Dave's upbringing, and when he headed off to college, his parents joined the Salvation Army. Dave and Cherry married young. He was 19 and she was 17, before they moved to Australia in 1968. I've heard this move was because Dave didn't consider America a good place to have a family, as he believed it was likely to fall to nuclear war or some other disaster. It was in Australia that Dave joined the Children of God, and while he claims to have only been involved for a period of months before the teachings around flirty fishing and other sexual aspects turned him away from David Mo Berg, it seems that he was quite influenced by the belief system. You can certainly see a lot of aspects of the Children of God in Dave's later religious practices, such as the dissemination of religious comic strips, and a timeline on the current Jesus Christians website says that they spent a lot of effort trying to re-establish common ground with the Children of God around 1996. Dave and Cherry had 4 children, though only the youngest, Christine, is still involved with them today. The family started distributing their own religious tracts in the early 1980s. The group became known around Sydney for giving away literature on the streets or asking for a few dollars in return to cover the printing. Dave asked those who might want to join them to forsake all of their money and give up their jobs to live by faith, relying on God to provide for them. The group usually lived out of buses and would dumpster dive whenever possible, rarely paying for food. They would travel to other cities to disseminate their literature, and it was in Melbourne around this time that Ross first came across Dave McKay.
I first encountered Dave on the street in the Bourke Street Mall in Melbourne in about 1980. He and his family were handing out religious tracts on the street in the Bourke Street Mall, and I had a conversation with him there, and I took the pamphlet and I went home and read it. And so, I was very interested in the content that he'd written, and it was talking about problems in the churches and, very idealistic Christian ideals that appealed to me, and about living in community and living simply with, minimal of material possessions, things like that. That was interesting to me at the time.
Dave has mentioned the Children of God and their way of life to numerous followers as an inspiration for what he was trying to achieve with his community. Ross was around 20 years old when he first met Dave, and he'd been attending the Geelong Revival Centre Church, which has been in the news recently in Australia for its extreme belief system. It came from the same roots as the Revival Fellowship, which we covered in the last episode of this podcast.
Well, I was attending a Pentecostal church at the time, which also uses verses about the early church in the book of Acts and how they spoke in tongues, for example. But then Dave was talking about the other more social side of it, where they were sharing all things in common. And this was really interesting to me, because the Pentecostal churches were talking about speaking in tongues and these things that the early church was doing, but they wouldn't talk about sharing everything. And in fact, there was more like a prosperity teaching, the opposite.
Ross took these other ideas to his pastor in the Pentecostal church and asked him why they weren't talking about sharing things in common while they were talking on these other aspects of early biblical teachings.
Oh, he said, that's not for today. And I said to him, that's a contradiction. You're saying speaking in tongues is for today and the healing is for today, but this sharing all things in common is not for today. But he didn't like me questioning him, and he started getting very authoritarian with me over my questioning. And that led to a confrontation between him and Dave at my house a week or two later. Yeah, an argument broke out and I was caught in the middle between the two of them. But yeah, that pastor didn't have any answers for Dave as far as I could. On the idealistic side of it, if you want to put it that way, on the idealism rang true to me about what Dave was saying compared to the standard Pentecostal line.
Dave told Ross that he'd had his own experiences with authoritarian pastors at Pentecostal churches, and that wasn't going to be his approach within his own community.
He wasn't like that, and he wouldn't do those things. And what we're going to have is a democracy, of discussion, of, where it's egalitarian. This is what he was presenting to me. So he wouldn't be like those authoritarian Pentecostal pastors. So that's what he was saying at the time. And that appealed to me, definitely, that idealism. And I was wanting to live out a more authentic form of Christianity that I wasn't seeing anywhere.
Ross wrote to me following the recent coverage of the alleged abuses within the Geelong Revival Centre that in hindsight he was out of the frying pan into the fire. But at the time, the way the Revival Centre treated him seemed to confirm that he was making the correct decision.
I got shunned for associating with Dave. So, I got excommunicated from that church, as a result of that. And nobody from the church would speak to me after that. A number of people were abused within that organisation that have since tried to bring that organisation to account since then, after I left, of course. But they basically illustrated to me that there was a problem there in the first place. So I didn't mind ditching them, even though it kind of hurt to lose my friends within that movement at the time.
In the early days of his involvement, Ross does feel like things were fairly democratic, but that Dave was more able to use his powers of persuasion to have things run the way he wanted. Ross and another young man were the only non-Mackay family members at that time, and they were a decade younger than Dave, so tended to feel comfortable that Dave knew more than they did, and usually let him talk them around to his point of view.
In the early days, it was easy to persuade us of a certain way of doing things or the next project that he had in mind. As time went on, I think as we got older, it was harder for him to persuade us, and therefore democracy wasn't working for him the way he wanted. And then he started to shift away from democracy. It wasn't overt, like he's saying, "Oh no, I want to get rid of democracy today, and we're just going to. I'm the end time prophet and do what I say." It was never that obvious. It was always very subtle. But, it became more he was asserting his opinions and dominating the airspace.
I asked Ross about the belief system at the time he first became involved with Dave. Dave mentioned to Ross that he had been involved with the Children of God.
He had lots of material from the Children of God, and he was, in a way, trying to recreate the Children of God. But I think that even though he had rejected the sexual doctrines of the Children of God, he really was actually copying the authority, trying to imitate Moses David in the kind of end time prophet mode of things, despite presenting to me at the time that he was wanting a democratic organization with, that sort of thing.
A few more people came into Dave's orbit around this time, and along with Ross, they all moved into the farmhouse where the Mackays were staying in a town called Tallangatta, near Albury Wodonga on the Victoria-New South Wales border.
So, yeah, it was like some kind of spiritual movement was happening. So, yeah, there were people my age arriving, and then it grew to about 15 or 12 or 15 people. And then we decided to move up to the north coast of New South Wales. And we were living in an old general store in a little country town. It was $30 a week for the general store. And yeah, it was sort of very hippie, which appealed to all of us, really. We were all sort of half hippies anyway. I think we were all happy to move away from Melbourne, and most of us were from Melbourne at that time anyway, and, go out on a new adventure somewhere.
Sharing all things in common in the Jesus Christians meant selling everything and handing over the proceeds to the poor or to the group. A doctrine that appealed a lot to Ross was not working a secular job for the primary motivation of money.
That didn't mean you couldn't receive money. It wasn't like you're forbidden to use money or receive money, but that wasn't your motive for work, any kind of work. So the idea was to work for love in whatever you did, for God, for the group, for society. And I felt very liberated in my mind by thinking about work in that way, because I'd only learned about, get a job. You need to get a job because you have to earn money to survive. That's all I knew. And then there was this liberating idea that, no, you could just do things because you were motivated out of love to help people. And if you had the right motive, the food or whatever you needed would come, whether it was without a salary or whatever. So we most of our earlier experiments were setting out to prove to ourselves that this would work, prove to each other and ourselves that, yes, we could survive without getting a job, that working for a boss that doesn't care about the planet or spiritual things, and that the only reason you're going to the job is to get money from him. And he uses your labour for whatever he wants, and you're just a slave to him. So that was very appealing.
The Jesus Christians, although not identifying by that name until 1996, became known for a variety of publicity stunts. Dave's history with newspapers seemed to give him a good eye for what he could do to keep his group in the headlines. Stunts included gluing dollar notes to the ground in Martin Place in Sydney's CBD to spell out the words, "Trust God, not money," for which some group members were arrested and fined for defacing public property. They refused to pay the fine. $2 notes were glued to the ground outside post offices around Victoria and New South Wales, with messages about greed, and some members were charged with offences for burning money. While some of this money would have come from selling their religious tracts, it should be noted that members were also receiving money from the taxpayer in the form of unemployment benefits up until 1996. Murals and graffiti were painted around town, and the group advertised their labour for free, an initiative that gained them a fair amount of publicity too. In 1985, a group of 6 members, including a then 11-year-old girl and Dave's 15-year-old daughter Christine, walked across the Nullarbor Plain, which for international listeners is a remote, inhospitable and arid part of Australia that stretches over 1,000 kilometres at its widest points. The group set out without any extra provisions, saying that they were trusting in God to provide in order to prove his existence. Again, the initiative gained a lot of media coverage, and the group was able to complete their walk over 55 days with help from the public. It's an undeniably incredible feat, but it didn't come without criticism. An article in the Sydney Morning Herald at the time quoted Director of Concerned Christian Growth Ministries, Adrian Van Leen, as saying, "This is a publicity stunt which does nothing to glorify God. It has done nothing to help others. All the attention has been focused on themselves." Throughout the 1980s and 90s, group members started outreach projects in the UK, the USA, and India, as well as continuing their work around Australia, so they weren't always together in the one place. Some travelled to the US in 1990 to hand out hundreds of thousands of copies of a comic book they'd created entitled The Fall of America, which claimed that, quote, 1. Within the next few years, the United States will be suddenly and almost totally destroyed in a surprise military attack by the Soviet Union. 2. Russia will not occupy the US after the battle, possibly because of nuclear contamination. 3. Survivors of the Holocaust will flee the country as refugees or be taken as prisoners to other countries. End quote. A number of group members did considerable work in Chennai, India, then known as Madras, on open sewage systems that posed a health risk to the local community, considered a slum. One member contracted typhoid from standing in raw sewage as part of a week-long stunt to bring attention to the issue, which included lowering a table down to signify holding a banquet in the effluent in December 1992. The Jesus Christians website mentions huge numbers of religious tracts being distributed around the world in different languages and at places like Glastonbury Festival. A number of members were arrested at the Royal Easter Show in Sydney in the late 1990s for distributing something called the Baby Book, as adults dressed in oversized nappies. The book included teachings credited to the children of God. In spite of the endless circulation of literature, the group's numbers seem to have only ever been in the tens at most. Nevertheless, their website suggests that Dave is still trying to grow an army for God. Under Teachings, there's a page called The Virgin Army that covers the army of 144,000 in Revelation chapter 7. Here's an excerpt from this page written by Dave. I have, for too long, been afraid of people calling us a cult that breaks up marriages, so I have bent over backwards to accommodate rebellious wives. Some members have clenched their fists every time I even hinted at husbands forsaking their wives for God. I thank God that we are finally free of that rebellious spirit, and I pray that we will never tolerate it again. Ross had a story that illustrated how this approach could play out, which he says happened around the year 2000.
The wife of one of the members, we'll put it that way, decided she didn't want to be a member anymore. She'd had enough. So she was still the wife of a member, but she wasn't expected to be a participating member in the group, so to speak, even though she was still living in a group house and so forth as somebody's wife, even though the husband was still a member. But I think at some point Dave didn't like that, and he wanted to pressure her to leave or try to break her psychologically like he did to me at one point. So he called a meeting of the people in the household at the time and said that what he wanted to do was, the wife wasn't in the house at the time, so this is a secret meeting, said what he wanted to do was he wanted to get the wife in a room, and that we would all surround her in the room, and that he would proceed to shout at her, shake her, and, kind of cast out devils, if you like, out of her to get her to break down and submit that she'd rebelled against God, and that's that you've rebelled against God, you need to repent, this sort of stuff. And that what he wanted us to do was to surround her and actually physically, by the number of bodies in the room, prevent her from leaving the room. Right? That's what he wanted us to do. And he was very persuasive that, this was going to bring a positive, good result. She was going to break down and repent and, come back to God.
The group, including the husband, agreed to go along with Dave's plan, but it didn't work. The wife stood up to him and said that even if it resulted in a breakdown of her marriage, she didn't care. She was not going to put up with this kind of bullying. And the other members didn't physically stop her from leaving. The woman walked out, and her husband chased after her, and the couple ended up both leaving a few months later.
After that happened, it wasn't really discussed. People were so shocked. It was like we didn't want to talk about it. And I don't think Dave wanted to push it any further. It's like he'd gone to this point and he realised he'd gone too far.
On the Jesus Christians website timeline page, there are many mentions of people leaving the group over time, and the mentions are very offhand, as if it's not a big deal. But the impression I got from Ross is that they were usually accompanied by many accusations and reams of writing and angst, which is reflected in other pages on the site as well. One good thing evidenced on the website is that, at least in the early days, the children's education seems to have been prioritised. Though through homeschooling it seems they may not have completed high school, which can of course make it tricky to access tertiary education. While Dave and Cherry are estranged from 3 of their 4 children, those children went on to have successful careers of various kinds. Here's another quote from the Virgin Army website page. "So what about singles who may want to marry? We cannot forbid any of them to marry, but I can pretty well promise them that if they do, they will end up feeling more comfortable working with ex-members than they will be working with us. And that is because we intend to grow quite literally toward the vision of being part of the Virgin Army, while all of the others are so afraid of appearing to be cultish that their hands are tied spiritually. They are being controlled by the spirit of Jezebel, usually in the form of their own wives." While much of the early coverage of the Jesus Christians was sympathetic, supporting them against various arrests and charges or profiling their sewer work in India, and framing any issues as being about corrupt government officials there, over time they started receiving more critical media. I couldn't find a copy of the report, but the Jesus Christians website mentions in 1991 that a newly recruited member's mother was to blame for Darren Hinch running a national TV hate report about the group. There's no indication as to why this mother would have had any concerns about her son joining a harmless Christian group. Over time it seems that Dave came to value the less complimentary coverage alongside the favourable reports, in certain respects. Ross has some ideas about why this is.
He wants attention, and if he can't get it in a positive way, he doesn't mind getting it in a negative way. So some of the earlier media attention that the group received was far more positive and idealistic. But then after some time, the media wasn't that interested in the group. And then I think he found he could get attention by being notorious. But then he would play the victim with that. So there was all this twisting around of, well, I'm going to bait the media by being a cult leader, but really I'm a victim. I'm not a cult leader. I'm really a nice guy. But they'll start to write a story about how I'm an evil cult leader, but really I'm innocent. So there's all this twisting and turning and playing games with the media. And you've watched some of the interviews and the way he interacts with the journalist, and he's playing chess and mind games with the journalist. And this becomes more obvious as time goes on with some of the interviews.
Ross mentioned British journalist Jon Ronson's documentary coverage in particular, and it's an interesting watch if you haven't seen it before. The Jesus Christians had been in the headlines again, over a missing 16-year-old boy, who was eventually found safe and sound at a campground with some community members. 2 members were arrested for withholding information on his whereabouts from the police, though the teenager was adamant that he had been there by choice and was never kidnapped as the papers had splashed across their headlines. If you believe Jon Ronson, Dave invited him to cover an exclusive story after he was the only reporter to write a favourable article about the supposed kidnapping. If you believe Dave McKay, the group was hesitant when Ronson started begging for us to let him do a documentary about us. The big secret revealed to Jon Ronson was that group members were looking to donate their kidneys to complete strangers. When I first heard about the kidney cult and how members donated a kidney to a stranger, I couldn't fathom how this could be anything other than a truly selfless act. I'm somebody who donates blood fairly regularly, and when I heard how difficult it is for women in Australia to source egg donations, I looked into the possibility of donating some of mine too. But these are things that the body resupplies. While humans don't need 2 functioning kidneys to survive, I feel less inclined to undergo surgery and lose my backup. The Jesus Christians certainly did hit the headlines in a big way once again with their kidney donations in the early 2000s. John Ronson wrote for The Guardian, quote, "Dave imagines that, when the world learns of his mass kidney donating plan, we'll regard it in one of two ways, either as a really lovely thing for the Jesus Christians to do, or as the self-destructive act of a religious cult acting under the spell of a notorious charismatic leader. I'm surprised to learn later that he is not only expecting the latter response, he is hoping for it." Ronson found out that Dave had been writing to various so-called anti-cult groups under the fictional name of Anita Foster, a concerned mother whose son had joined the Jesus Christians. Ronson shared in the second part of his Guardian article, "This is Dave's plan. The fictitious Anita's fictitious son will donate a fictitious kidney. Anita will inform the anti-cult groups and imply that Dave is coercing his followers to sell their kidneys on the black market and that the money will go to him. They will tell the tabloids, and the tabloids will go into a week-long frenzy about the self-mutilating kidney cult. Then, and here's my role in the grand scheme, I'll arrive on the scene with the true story of the Jesus Christians' remarkable philanthropy." End quote. I have to admit I'm pretty unclear on why so much negative publicity would aid the cause, which was supposedly to encourage others to think about altruistic living organ donation. It seems more likely that kind of approach might be about creating doubt about any negative media coverage of the Jesus Christians in general, and perhaps discrediting those who are concerned about potential coercive elements within the group. In any case, Ronson expressed how uncomfortable he was about it, and Dave didn't go through with the plan in the end. But there was still plenty of negative coverage without him fostering it. It's inarguable that group members literally saved lives. And watching John Ronson's documentary, it's clear that the members trying to donate are doing it from a good and thoughtful place. I haven't come across anyone yet who has regretted doing it, even if they're no longer with the community. In the UK, the law said that you couldn't donate a kidney to a stranger, and the documentary follows UK-based member Sue, who advertised her kidney online and by leafleting near dialysis wards. Her aim was to find someone who would agree to creating a backstory of close friendship in order to allow her to donate. In Australia at the time, live organ donation to a stranger was not permitted either, and members of the Jesus Christians lied to authorities about relationships with recipients in order to donate. The law has subsequently been updated in New South Wales to allow for donations to strangers. I asked Ross about his impression of Dave's motives with the initiative.
Dave had this radar for getting something very high idealistic like kidney donation, which is a wonderful, beautiful thing. But then it's like his id has to twist it and turn it into a publicity stunt, right? And to get attention and publicity. And there's this double motive for everything. As I said, there's this high motive, high ideal, and then there's this grubby sort of, attention-seeking thing that's underneath that mars the whole experience with him.
I wondered whether Ross had any sense of Dave enjoying being able to exercise quite a lot of influence in getting followers to do such an extreme thing, but he didn't think it was really like that.
Maybe he gets a kick out of being able to persuade other people to do such a thing, but at the same time, it's because I don't think anyone was coerced or forced to donate. He donated himself, and he's quite prepared to take those risks and take the lead and not say, well, you do this and I won't do that. He'll do it. But as I said, there's always this other double twisted motive that has to go along at the same time. At that point, he was like milking the whole thing for as much publicity as he could get out of it. So, yeah, you come away with a sort of a mixed feeling about the whole thing in the end.
By the end of his documentary, John Ronson had conflicting feelings about the whole thing as well. One of the potential recipients in the UK did not end up being chosen for a kidney donation from the Jesus Christians. And Ronson says in his script, "Dave sent me an email. He wrote that Christine in Scotland was dying. He said he could instruct one of his members to give her a kidney, but if he did, I'd only accuse him of manipulation. So instead, he wrote, he had decided to let Christine die and let her death be on my conscience." End quote. This is followed up by a video Dave sent to Ronson of himself speaking to camera and essentially saying the same thing, that Christine had taken a turn for the worse and, quote, "I have to make a decision whether we're going to help her at all." He says that one of his followers could donate to save her, but that this follower, though willing, wasn't very keen. Dave says he could push him into doing it, but has decided not to and will let Christine's blood be on Ronson's head and on the head of the authorities in England who decided there's something wrong with a group of Christians who want to donate their kidneys. It's strange to watch Dave say plainly that the decision is his and that he could push a member to do something that they weren't that keen to do, yet prickle at any kind of portrayal of him by Ronson as coercive or manipulative. He says he'll go ahead with the documentary on the condition that this video is included, and it's not a video that makes him look great, at least to this viewer. Over the years, the Jesus Christians have protested in action on climate change, Australia's incredibly harsh treatment of asylum seekers, and many other things that I've also protested myself. Dave and Cherry released a book called The Worst of Woomera in 2002, which had stories of some of the asylum seekers in one of Australia's controversial immigration detention centres that was shut down in 2003. Though I was appalled to read that the book included stories of 2 detainees who had requested they remain off the record, as they feared harm could come to their families back home, even if they were shared anonymously. A practice that was in place from the very early days of the group was something they referred to as their grievance system. Members who had an issue with each other were to take it up one-on-one and try to resolve it, with the option of bringing in a couple of others and then escalating to the entire group if it couldn't be resolved. It sounds like it often involved a fair amount of berating from Dave. Ross described one of these sessions to me, and this one was towards the end of his 3 decades with the Jesus Christians.
In this particular incident, David decided I'd done something wrong, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see that I'd done anything wrong, but he was intent on convincing me that I'd done this thing wrong. He brought his wife in to witness and to have a discussion, and then basically proceeded through the whole day where he is trying to break me down to admitting that I'd done something wrong. And I'm just saying, no, I didn't do that. And it was like he was trying to break me psychologically into admitting it. And I said, no, I didn't do anything. This is not what I did. And I believe he was trying to break me down psychologically and basically lie to myself and just give up and get out of the meeting by confessing my sin, if you like. And I didn't, because I just didn't. I said I can't confess to something I don't see as wrong, no matter what you see. I was totally exhausted by that by the end of the day. In the end, he gave up.
This was the point at which Ross started to distance himself from the group. He was suffering from depression and thinks that his fragile mental health is why Dave let him become what he calls an associate member, who bought tracts from the group and distributed them independently.
This is after years of feeling like I was always a perpetual teenager. I was never treated by him as an adult, an equal adult. And I began to realise I would never be an equal adult in his eyes. He'd always keep me in a level of like I was his teenage son or something. Yeah, that was depressing, really. And I just wanted to get more independence away from him so I didn't have to endure his interrogations. But I believe he was trying to keep me psychologically at the level of a child in order to keep control of me and neutralising any influence I had on the group. And then by that time there were newer members arriving, people in their 20s, early 20s, arriving, new generation. And he didn't want me influencing them. He wanted to keep his influence predominant over everything. So I was just pushed to the side. Even though I'd been there for 30 years, I wouldn't make any difference.
While Dave was happy for Ross to remain an associate member for some time, things changed in late 2010 and early 2011 when the Jesus Christians decided it was time to become much more secretive. In an email shared by former members, Dave wrote to the group on the 1st of November 2010, quote, "In some ways I do want to give the impression that we have disappeared, i.e. imploded. It's what they've been trying to force us to do, so theoretically it should shut them up, though I doubt that it will, especially when they learn that we are still out there on the streets. but it does make us more inaccessible to their abuse. At any rate, I think that the action is hard to spin as positive since it is a move away from the spotlight and into the caves, based more on an assessment of the hopelessness of the world's situation.
I'm pretty sure he decided that parents were a threat to him and that he was going after excommunicating family and cutting off relationship with parents was starting to become important to him because he felt that there was too much influence from parents that wasn't there before. We were encouraged to write letters to our parents, to go and see our parents. There was no, super conflict with parents unless parents were particularly antagonistic, but we weren't trying to antagonize parents. But at this point in 2011, he was basically saying, we're going underground. Don't talk to your parents. Give them the bare minimum of information. And I said at the time, this was in a chat. All this was happening in a chat. I said, I think this is going to be very hurtful to parents and it's going to cause problems. And that's when I got cut off.
The November 2010 email also discusses a change in attitude to the press. Quote, "It may be time to see the media as not being the tool we have always considered it to be in the past. Rather than criticise me for taking a different position now, can't we just discuss the pros and cons of the media as we prepare for the trib? Perhaps we were wrong in the first place, or perhaps circumstances have changed. Let's just discuss it without digs at leadership." End quote. Here the term trib refers to the tribulation, which always seemed to be around the corner. And here's one more quote from Dave on the Virgin Army page of the Jesus Christians website. "What I am suggesting now is that we must at least be willing to cut our ties with all of these vestiges of respectability that each of our system and family friendships represents, and to spiritually disappear, if need be, into the great unknown in the way of all so-called cults. It is the willingness of any group to cut all ties with their families and with the system that gets them labelled a cult in the first place, but it is this same willingness that makes them so effective. It may be time for us to discover the same effectiveness." I asked Ross if he would tell me more about what happened with Dave on the day that he was suddenly ousted from the Jesus Christians. Remember that he'd been an associate member for a while at this point, and had maintained a relationship with the group without being fully enmeshed in it.
He calls a meeting, and it's an internet meeting because there's people in different countries by now. I'm on a terminal having this chat where he's saying, right, now we're going to disappear. I want the group to disappear. We've got threats overseas, objecting parents to some, 18-year-olds who want to join, and we need to disappear. And I raised my objections on the chat. I was in the library and I'm writing my objections. There's a couple of other people are writing their objections from England that I knew. And the chat just stops dead. And I'm sitting there and waiting half an hour, nothing. And then it just dawned on me that I'd been excommunicated, that they'd gone underground, and because I hadn't agreed to go underground, that's it, you're gone. No more communication. And I realised I've known this guy for 30 years and he's just going to do that to me, just like that. And there's no, oh, I'm sorry, we have to do this to you because you don't agree and we're just going to go and do it. And I said, because I remember writing in the chat, I said, well, if this is what you want to do, go ahead and do it, but I'm not going to do it. So, let's, if this is the way you want to do things, whoever agrees with you wants to go and do that, do it. If that's what you want to do, but I don't agree with it. I'm not going to cut off my parents. But there was no explanation of, okay, well, I'm sorry you feel that way and see you later. And there was a few loose ends to be communicated and things like that. Doesn't matter. Just gone. You're gone. No further communication.
The Jesus Christians website was largely dormant between 2011 and 2019, with an initial message saying that the group had disbanded, then replaced by one that said they had graduated and that Dave and Cherry had retired. Group members all changed their names when they went underground, which they referred to as the implosion. The deceptive nature of this approach might seem unchristian to some, but like the children of God, Dave had spoken about when it was okay to lie.
It started off with a teaching there that basically you have to be careful about who you should be honest with. His illustration was, if you're hiding Jews in your house and a Nazi comes to your door, do you say, "Oh, I cannot tell a lie, there are Jews in my house"? No, you would be dishonest. You would deceive the Nazis, right? So his argument was that any small group like his or like ours has enemies, and you have to be careful what you say to them, and you have to be dishonest to them at times, if necessary. So he had this: the enemies of the group need to be deceived. You have to be careful what you say to the media or whoever out there, and deceiving them is part of the strategy you would use. But given what I understand now, he would be using deception on virtually anyone, including people inside the group as well. So he's not being fully honest with people inside the group if it suits him and it suits his purposes. We thought he was being honest with us, but he's not.
I mentioned to Ross that this reminded me of the Children of God comic, Deceivers Yet True.
Dave used to quote that one. I never really believed him on that supposed interpretation, but it suited him.
A former member named Alan recounted his story of being kicked out of the group just after they went underground in early 2011. He was going through a divorce from his wife, who wasn't in the Jesus Christians, and she was living in a house with their daughter that he had co-owned. As Alan tells it, her lawyers were saying she stood a good chance of getting 100% of the house if it went to court, because Alan had left it with her 2 years prior to join the Jesus Christians. Alan's lawyers were saying that he had a good chance of getting the house himself, and he came to the conclusion that the lawyers were likely the only ones who would come out on top if he didn't accept a settlement offer that his wife put forward. It seems that Alan was expelled from the group because he opted to take the settlement offer rather than fight his wife for his share of the house. In internal group correspondence published on the Making It Real website, which is run by some other former members, the Jesus Christians' position was that Alan was not forsaking all by not going after the house. A member then called Kyle wrote to the group in exploring the matter, "It was clearly not about the community wanting more money, which is what Alan may well be thinking/saying between the lines, but about whether he was willing to properly forsake all and take a stand." He wrote that another community member, Jack, remembers Alan saying that he didn't want to push his daughters away through the sale of the house, so it is about his unwillingness to forsake his wider family too. After a few years underground, group members started posting YouTube videos under the name End Time Survivors and A Voice in the Desert. There was no mention of the Jesus Christians or any identifying details in their recordings. This is where Daniel Ryer came across Dave's teachings.
We're at a time in our life when we were searching for, stability and community, and I actually stumbled across their YouTube channel. I think it still is called A Voice in the Desert. And then at that time, it was about 2017, they only had probably 30 videos of really early stages for them. And they were all just basic teachings of Jesus, animated videos that, resonated with me at the time and with my upbringing and my beliefs that I grew up with. And so, so I reached out through one of those videos and just said, just a message. Thank you, for making these videos. They're great, and from there, it started a back and forward with emails to what I found out later was to Dave himself. He went under the, name of just Voice. And these back and forth emails went on for probably a few weeks. And then in one of those emails, I made a side comment of look, if you're ever in the area, drop in. You can use our farm as somewhere to, park your buses and while you're travelling through. And within a week or two after that, I had the whole Australian community of 6 adults and 3 children on my farm.
In part 2 of this episode, you'll hear Daniel Rya's story and about more recent developments of the group, including Dave's latest court appearance in Australia. I hope you'll join us. Thanks so much for joining me for part 1 of this episode of Let's Talk About Sects. A huge thanks to Ross and Daniel for their openness in sharing their stories with me for the show. You'll hear more from Daniel in the second part. Let's Talk About Sects is an independent, listener-funded project. Please consider supporting the show via Patreon, as your support is what makes it a viable endeavour. You can access episodes early and ad-free with your contribution at patreon.com/LTASpod. You can also listen to my audiobook, Do As I Say, which is linked in the show notes, or grab some merch. Something you can always do for free is give the podcast a rating on the podcast platform of your choice, or share it with a friend. This episode of Let's Talk About Sects was written and researched by me, Sarah Steele. Original music by Joe Gould.